Welcome to Econ Thoughts, the podcast series of the Society of Professional Economists in the UK in London. And today I'm very pleased to have as guest Nick Eberstadt, who holds the Henry Wen Chair in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute, where he researches and writes on demographics, economic developments, but also on the Korean Peninsula and Asia. We're going to maybe talk a little bit about that later on, but the conversation today is going to be focused more on demographics and also on the latest writings of Nick. In particular, he's the author of many books, including Men Without Work, America's Invisible Crisis, which was originally published in 2016, but it was also updated in 2022, I believe, post-pandemic. And I wonder whether at some point we might even need a further update of the book, because the crisis might get worse or better, who knows. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you for inviting me.
I think also very recently, Nick, you also wrote an article, Foreign Affairs, on the age of the population. So we might get to that particular conversation. But before we do that, I wanted to set a little bit of a context and to frame the conversation around the topic of economic growth, which is a central topic that we discuss a lot on this podcast. And if you look at normal kind of production function, you think about what are the elements of growth, we always think about the kind of labor supply in terms of the number of people. Then you think about the number, also how much those people work, and also the level of productivity and the use that they make of capital. And if you look at the broader trends now, and is discussed in some of your writings as well, we have a kind of bit of a demographic crisis, or at least a fertility crisis in Western countries. Then there is also the issue around actually how many people are actually at work as well. And this is the subject of your book. And finally, also, the amount of people that we have affects the level of innovation. From some of the writing from Charles Jones and also from Julian Simon in the past as well, and most recently from kind of Marian Tupy, who we had actually from Cato, which had on the podcast a few years back. The more people you have, the more likely you have new ideas, innovation, and therefore you drive productivity. So you almost think everything seems to bring back to the issue of how many people do we have. So my question to you then will be, how bad is it in terms of the fertility crisis and the demographic crisis?
Well, the fertility trends, as you know, are on what seem like a relentless march downward. And I'm not sure that we have a very good explanation for why birth rates are plunging in so many different, seemingly unrelated parts of the world, since in a number of low-income areas, the fertility levels are dramatically lower than in the United States, or even in Europe, even lower than in Italy. We are still, I think, left scratching our heads on why exactly this is happening in so many different places. But of course, that will constrain labor force in the future. It will constrain total population numbers in the future. It will force graying in societies, since it is, in terms of the arithmetic of population structure, it's low fertility rather than longevity that really dramatically charges the graying of societies. And all of this creates a lot of pressures that countries, populations, governments, societies, families, businesses will all have to be adjusting to.
Yeah. And what kind of life, what kind of economy do we need to have in the future? That's a question about if your dependency ratio kind of increases, what does it mean? What kind of changes to the way our economy works and also our policy works will need to be introduced to be able to address those issues, particularly when it comes to next 20, 30, 40 years, when those changes will be quite dramatic?
Well, of course, if we make no changes at all, we have a pretty dire situation on our hands, not just in terms of public finance, since we've generally fallen into the routine of financing through pay-as-you-go systems, where current workers are the taxpayers financing current retirees. When you turn the population pyramid on its head, that's pretty unforgiving. But in businesses, in households and families, with the pressure on savings and investments that we can expect through regular life cycle models. We see a lot of new and unfamiliar pressures that will be facing us. Now, in fairness, if we were talking half a century ago, we might have had the same sort of conversation about the population explosion. We would have said that this is, all of the Cole Hoover models will show that all of the investment is going to be eaten up by consumption, and we're not going to be able to innovate, and we're not going to be able to grow. And during the past 50 years, I think the world has seen a remarkable march towards progress, as I'm sure Marian Tupy would have emphasized, despite the surge in population all over the world, and especially in the poorest countries. So I'm not sensationally alarmed about these changes, except for the fact that we are completely unfamiliar with the new pressures we're going to be facing. I think human beings generally are quite adaptable. We're an adaptable species. We're an inventive group, these humans. Whether we can adapt on the spot is going to be the real question.
Yeah, no, indeed. And I think we can come back in a second about not necessarily just the number of people, but how many people do work, and the issue particularly with men, as you discuss in your books. But before we go there, a lot of the kind of issue that you could see is, particularly if longevity increases, do we need to change something big in terms of the retirement age, and therefore how many years people do work? And in that sense, from an economic point of view, in terms of growth, it might also kind of counteract a little bit the fall in the number of people, but we work essentially more years, more hours. So the number of workers may actually still remain the same, even if actually the broader kind of denominator in terms of population is lower.
Of course, I totally agree with you. I mean, and the OECD's slogan, live longer, work longer, makes total sense. And actually, all of us are living under a tremendously beneficial trend, which is the continuous improvement in global life expectancy, and even the continuous improvement in life expectancy of the front runners. One of the fascinating things that demographic economists have demonstrated, it's a bit of a mystery, but it's positive and fascinating. So from the 1840s to the present, the longest living country in the world, that title has shifted over the time, of course, but the longest living country in the world has seen its life expectancy at birth for women increase by about 3 months per year. And this is for 2 centuries almost, since the 1840s. Exactly why it should be so remarkably regular, I don't think anybody has explained. But what this means is that the horizons for health have been constantly improving, because there has been a compression of morbidity during this long ascent. So that it's not that people are living 30 more years, and 25 years of those they're spending in a wheelchair. There's a lot more potential for active life. So I would think the economies of not just affluent societies, but developing societies would want to capitalize upon unlocking the value of health that we're seeing as this tremendous benefit all around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other question is it politically feasible, though, to actually increase? Because that's the issue. In a sense, we are the same retirement age than probably we had more than 50 or 60 years ago, even if, as you say, in 56 years, if 3 months a year, you're looking probably a kind of more than a decade in terms of life expectancy, but we still have the same retirement age as it was. So at some point, we might need to see a shift. Politically, though, we see that every time a government tries to do that, people are on the street. So how do we do it from a political point of view? Is there some kind of economic incentive or tools that can help, or is it just about pure politics?
Well, the politics of retirement reform or retirement adjustment seems to work somewhat differently in different rich countries. There's some countries where populations seem to be very unconvinced by this. There are other countries where it seems to be rather easier to get a consensus nationally on what I would call reforms. So the essence there, of course, is to convince people in a democratic system that there's something beneficial about these changes, and even if these changes may mean a short-term loss for certain people, a temporary short-term loss, it won't necessarily be a long-term loss for them, and it certainly won't be a long-term loss for their societies. So, I mean, this is the old art of persuasion, and we seem to have been very much less successful with persuasion in some rich countries than others.
Yeah, and it might be that at some point a crisis might force your hand in terms of, particularly when it comes to the concept of the dependency ratio and kind of social security kind of running out of money. It might be that at that point you'll be forced.
Well, exigency is a remarkable convincer.
Indeed, exactly. So we probably might need to look at when actually Social Security will run out of money. That might be the time when a reform might happen. Now we talked a little bit about demographics, the number of people. We talked about how long they live and they work. But in terms of the number of people that actually are employed and do work compared to the population. And this is why kind of when we looked at the rate and talk about labor policy, labor supply, my preference is always for the employment ratio as opposed to unemployment ratio, because it looks at how many people are working. And obviously there are a lot of definitions. You look at the whole population, you look at prime age, and so on. So it would be interesting to get your thoughts based on your writing and books in terms of, particularly in the United States, in America, where are we in terms of employment ratio for prime age, and particularly for male, and what difference do you have between kind of men and women, and are those trends actually continuing, or do we see a change in the last few years?
Well, I'm very much in sympathy with you in looking at the employment to population ratio, because I think that's the critical indicator here. We in the United States have a system of employment and labor statistics that were developed during the Great Depression with Great Depression concerns in mind. So our system focuses upon the number of unemployed rather than upon employment rates. And of course, it comes up with numbers of employed people, but the politically key discussion point for our Federal Reserve and for Wall Street and for politics as we head into an election is the unemployment rate. And in a Great Depression world where there are only two options for people, having a job or looking for one, make enough sense. Yeah. But in our affluent post-war economy in the United States, there's a third category that has become especially important for men of prime working age, and that's NILF, not in labor force, neither working nor looking for work. And over the past two generations in the United States, the fastest growing component of our prime working age group for men of the 25 to 54s has been this, let's call them labor force dropouts. And nowadays, for every man in this group who is unemployed, there are 3, or in some years 4, men who are neither working nor looking for work. So if you're only looking at the unemployment rate, you're missing 3/4, 4/5 of the phenomenon. In my own writing on this, I've argued that this labor force dropout phenomenon in the United States is socially significant. It has some economic significance as well. I'm not smart enough to tell you what the political significance is, but it might have some of that too. Since the pandemic, we've had this bizarre spectacle in the United States of a peacetime labor shortage, where after the pandemic, with the recovery of the U.S. economy, we had roughly 7 million men in this dropout pool and a total of over 12 million job openings. So, of course, this was work that wasn't necessarily going to be delimited to these dropout men, but we saw other dropouts as well. One of the heartening trends in the United States over the generation before the pandemic was the rise in employment for older Americans, for the 55 plus group. That was really the main ray of sunshine in the U.S. labor tableau. Since the pandemic, there's been a drop in labor force participation and in work for men and women over the age of 55, and it hasn't come back. It hasn't come back despite the enormous number of unfilled jobs, despite the rollout of the vaccines. So this is a curiosity that's added to the younger dropout men. The situation for prime age women, I think, has been very positive, as you know. The unprecedented prime age labor force participation rates for women for the 25 to 54 group. At the same time, something very curious has happened there. If there are 7 million men who are dropouts from this prime age pool, there are about 3 million dropouts from the counterpart, from the women's side. By this, I mean women who are neither working nor looking for work, who have no children at home, and who are not presently married. And as a bookend to the dropout men, I think this group may turn out to merit some concern as well, because the time use surveys, which where people self-report what they do all day long, suggest that the patterns of time use are a little bit too close for comfort for these, what I would call dropout women, to the dropout men. And in both groups, you see a very high self-reported incidence of use of pain medication on a daily basis. We need to pay attention to this too, even though superficially the situation for prime age women in the U.S. economy is looking quite positive.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It's good actually to distinguish with those three elements: the prime age men, prime age women, and then the over 55. But on the reason for the labor dropout from prime age men, you hinted a little bit about potentially kind of use of pain medication. What was the reason before the pandemic? What drove that actually? Is it kind of primarily about kind of health situation, or there were other kind of drivers underneath?
Well, so I think that the received wisdom among labor economists for a number of decades was that this was a consequence of structural economic change in the United States, of the decreased demand for less skilled work, globalization, and entry of China into the WTO, and all of the other demand-driven phenomena that we're familiar with. And there's truth to this, of course, but for the United States, at least, it's not the whole story. And I argued it isn't even most of the story. Because one of the really fascinating aspects to this problem of dropout men was the steady, almost linear a decline in labor force participation between the 60s and the years right before the pandemic. And if this had been a demand-driven phenomenon, one would have expected to see some cyclicality
Yep.
tracking with the business cycle, but it's not. It's almost linear. It almost looks like some sort of geophysical, geophysical trend. So something else is going on, and I argue in my studies that it's not explained by these big technical changes and these big structural changes.
Yeah.
One of the things which we see, of course, is the role of disability benefits as a sort of a unintended substitute for a kind of almost like a very low level of guaranteed income. Another thing which we see is the rise of a very large but still statistically invisible group of men who have a felony conviction in their background. We have a very different situation in the U.S. from any other OECD country as regards crime and punishment. About 1 in 7 adult men today, by my very rough calculations, has a felony conviction in his biography. And this has to have direct and immediate consequences with regards to odds of reentry into the workforce, but for very to me, unfathomable reasons, the US government statistical system has had almost no interest in casting some light on this particular big problem in our country.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think I was actually thinking about a couple of topics or a couple of reasons maybe could look at. And one of them was whether actually that increasing labor dropouts amongst men in prime age was related to manufacturing and the China shock, for example. But that was you kind of said probably not, because it's been relatively constant over the years. The other one was, and you mentioned already, potentially kind of issue around welfare. So if you get a lot of disability and a lot of money or universal basic income to almost to a certain extent, then there is no incentive actually to go back to work, because potentially you got a cliff edge when the moment you lose your benefits and you go back into employment. But obviously that is one reason, but it doesn't explain everything. To a certain extent, and your last point about kind of felony as well, it is difficult to understand, but it's a bit hopeful, because there is a policy solution to that potential, to make it easier actually for felons or previous felons to actually do work, or similar on the disability issue. Well, you can do welfare reform in the same way it was done in the 90s with President Clinton. So if those were the two main causes, I could say difficult to tackle, but we know what they are, and there is a solution to it. As you said, the danger is that we don't know it, and therefore we don't know what actually might work. And that's probably where it's a little bit more scary.
Yes. No, I think those are very good points. And we could certainly reduce the barriers to entry for ex-felons with the political wisdom and guidance and a little bit of political will. We could have a reinvention of our bizarre disability archipelago in the United States. There's no office in Washington, D.C., where I'm in Washington at the moment. There's not an office in the D.C. government that can tell you how many Americans are on disability programs, since they don't talk to each other. And the vision of a welfare reform as per single mothers getting benefits in the 1990s, I think, is a very compelling one for the male dropouts.
Yeah, and I think those are good. I'm thinking about looking forward. Do you see any changes in the trends that's kind of leaving aside policy reform we just discussed? Do you think actually some of these are temporary based on the pandemic, or are actually more structural and therefore they will continue?
I think we have to look at them separately. What's going on with the older Americans, with the 55 plus group, I suspect, although I can't demonstrate this yet because I haven't done the proper work on this. I suspect this has to do with wealth effects.
Yeah.
Uh, at first, I had surmised that this was just the wealth effect of transfers during the pandemic, but it looks as if older Americans of all educational backgrounds have reduced their workforce participation. So that I don't think is explained simply by these temporary pandemic transfers. Uh, for uh, for dropout prime age men, um, really haven't seen any sign that labor force tightness has an
Yeah.
effect on drawing them back into the workforce. We've got 25 years of data on this now, and we know quite confidently that unemployed men are going to circulate back into the labor force. We don't see that with the male dropouts yet, and we need to have a different approach there, I
Yeah.
think. And with this new group, exponentially growing group of female dropouts, we need to start paying attention to this as well, because I worry that we may see some of the same things that we've seen with the dropout men. This is not a form of gender equality that we want in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's going kind of backwards. One question I had, you mentioned earlier on about the social impact of actually the labor dropout in a sense, and what those might be. I mean, there's been a few conversations recently and a few books published around the um, the value of work in itself, independently of the income that it brings, in terms of bringing kind of self-respect, dignity, and therefore actually increasing potentially the level of civic mindedness of people who actually do work and purpose as well. And so I just wondered whether you can say a few words around outside the economic sphere, and what are the social impacts of actually having an increasing population or essentially without working.
Well, if we look at uh, what's happened with men of prime working age who have no work, and view this through the lens of self-reported time use, we see a pretty dispiriting picture. This is all self-reported. The dropout men report that they are basically disengaged from civil society. There's very little worship. There's almost no volunteering. There's almost no charitable work. Um, Although they would seem to have a great deal of time on their hands, they don't seem to be terribly engaged in housework or in help with other persons in the home. They don't. They get out of the house less and less, and they spend enormous amounts of time in front of screens. Um, with this as there's a lot of circularity here,
Yeah.
perhaps, but it's not surprising that this sort of a regimen is going to lead to great disheartening and even to depressed spirits. It has a consequence as well for the fragility of families and the fragility of communities. It may have an indirect impact upon confidence and trust in societies, on social
Yeah.
capital. I wouldn't want to push that too hard, but I'd want to at least raise the question.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think what I was thinking is, as you mentioned, the almost kind of, is it linked to the decline in, as you say, social capital and institution at the middle level? So obviously you are the family at the bottom as one kind of key, a crucial institution, obviously the state at the top, but then you have a lot of those association that kind of disappear, which is the local clubs,
Yes.
people involved, as you say, in school,
Yes.
churches, and going back to kind of bowling alone by Putnam to a certain extent. Sure. If you hollow out that middle level of association, is it a cultural explanation for all this? Is one. And the other one is technological around, is it a lot to do with also potentially social media and kind of the internet age as well? How much those two forces, cultural and technological, are kind of influencing this? And they might be affecting also female as well, because they might be more affected by the technological than the cultural, maybe.
Sure. Well, I mean, Eric Hurst and other people have done work on the technological innovations in video games and the extent to which this may have affected the market for leisure, if you want to call it that. Although I would caution that we have a sort of a default tick as
Yeah,
economists to talk about free time as leisure, but I think that it would be better to talk about leisure as regarding the sort of activities that are elevating rather than the activities that are degrading. And I'm afraid that a lot of the allocation of free time for the men without work has been in ways that have uh, made their lives kind of
yeah,
more difficult, and maybe even to them seemingly hopeless.
yeah, yeah. And the cultural element is like, is there a way actually to bring that back? It, will that help? It's obviously a long term project, if you see what I mean, or shift, but it might be something that on many different levels might be helpful.
Oh, I think very much so. I mean, you can do the very simple thought experiment that know that being out of the workforce for a long period of time does not necessarily lead to the degradation of skills and to hopelessness. I mean, we have tens of millions of counterexamples in the United States, and they're called women and they're called mothers who are out of the workforce for
Mm.
years, but are still attractive to employers because the skills that they honed as mothers of being responsible and paying attention to time and showing up even when they can't take a sick day because they were children at home, have made them attractive to employers. We don't see that same skill set with dropout men as much. Some of the people who are out of the labor force, to be sure, in this male group are basically full-time students who are
Okay.
training and getting ready to go back at they hope at an advanced levels. But they have they reveal completely different time use patterns from the men who are neither in employment nor in education and training.
Yeah, absolutely. And the point is around kind of the 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 social capital element. I'm not sure whether you looked at. I think there is social capital project, which has a social capital index that look at different at the state level and county level, whether there is any correlation between that and the labor dropout. I don't know. Maybe whether there has been anyone that has looked in any detail to that connection to that kind of cultural kind of and an institutional kind of connection.
Yeah, well, there is, and um, one of the fascinating overlooked projects for research in the United States. I mean, not entirely overlooked, but it's understudied, I should say, is examining the enormous differences that have emerged in labor force participation rates for men or for men and women from one locality to the next across the country. Because uh, there has been an extraordinary dispersion of workforce participation rates within US states. It's not just between like a depressed Appalachian region or
Yeah.
a Rust Belt, but it's like within Florida, within California, within Texas. There are enormous differences. And these haven't been examined nearly as
Mm.
closely as they should be.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe some piece of research that I will suggest from the podcast today. Do you see, have you looked at similar patterns outside the United States? Do you see similarities or kind of societies are quite different?
I have to confess that I haven't looked
Okay.
nearly as closely outside of the United States. I tend to think that some of the phenomena I've described in the US may be particular to the
Yep.
United States of America, in particular, the felon
Yeah.
question. I
I
mean,
would
I don't
think.
think we really see that elsewhere. Um, of course, there has been a general tendency to declining prime age male workforce participation. The United States has been, so to speak, so very successful in achieving this race to the bottom.
Yeah, thank you. Before we close off, any policy suggestion or solution recommendation that your research has kind of highlighted in terms of trying to reverse the trends?
Well, of course, training and skills is one aspect. Not everybody in the U.S. or elsewhere is right for college or for higher education, but everybody should graduate from school with a skill. And I don't think it's a secret that the U.S. K through 12 system is terribly spotty in this regard. So that's certainly one aspect. We've already talked about reforming disability programs. I sort of prefer the idea or the concept of a work first principle. Others might disagree. I realize that any proposed policy has unintended consequences, but my surmise is that the unintended consequence of a work first principle would be smaller than the unintended consequences of the existing system. We need to have information about the enormous invisible ex-con population in the United States. These would be three areas where I'd suggest there'll probably be plenty for the U.S. political system to try to digest.
Yeah, absolutely. And whether they will get any kind of room in the long list of policy that after the election will be for a new administration will be interesting to see. Well, thank you so much, Nick, for the conversation today. And it's been kind of very insightful. And we covered a topic which is very important because it is the fundamental kind of basic for future growth, actually, because we need people to work as well and contribute to society.
Indeed. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Today, our guest was Nick Eberstadt for the American Enterprise Institute, and welcome to our show. And maybe we'll see you again in the future. Thank you very much for listening.